Here is the direct, full English translation of your story, preserving the exact plot, structure, length, and tone. My name is Hannah Crane. I am 29 years old, and on Christmas Eve 2025, I stood on the doorstep of my parents' house in Scarsdale, New York, wearing the exact same work boots I had spent the last 11 hours in. They were covered in drywall dust and paint splatters. As soon as I walked in, the conversations in the living room fell silent. My mother was the first to look down. "Hannah," her voice grew tense. "Did you seriously come dressed like that?" I looked down. The white carpet beneath my feet was already stained. My father slowly set his glass of whiskey down on the glass table. "On purpose." "On purpose," he said, looking at the guests. "Some people never rise above their level." My older brother Michael sneered. "She could have at least tried to look normal." My mother quickly wiped the table where I had rested my hand, as if I were dirt, as if I were something that needed to be erased. And right at that moment, my grandfather, who was sitting in the corner, slowly stood up. He was 84. He leaned on his cane, but his voice was firm. He looked straight at my father and said, "Maybe I should remind everyone who you were before you became a crane?" The room became so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. They didn't know. They didn't have the slightest idea. They didn't know that these boots had already walked through projects worth more than their entire house. And they certainly didn't know that in 9 days, I would step onto a stage in front of 250 people, and their perfect world would crack. But before I tell you what happened that evening, let's go back. Because it all started much earlier. I grew up in Scarsdale. If you don't know what kind of place that is, imagine a town where the price of a house is status, and your profession is your identity. People here don't ask, "How are you?" They ask, "What do you do?" My father, Richard Crane, was a financial advisor. Suits, ties, business dinners. My mother, the picture-perfect housewife with an immaculate reputation. My brother, a Columbia University graduate, a future partner at an investment firm. And me. I was the child nobody talked about out loud. The truth that was hidden in our family was simple. The name Crane was not real. We used to be Kowalski. My grandfather, Thomas Kowalski, was a builder, not a manager, not an investor. He built houses with his own hands, foundations, walls, roofs. He started in the 70s with a single truck. By the 90s, he had a small but respected business, and my father hated it. Not the work itself, but how it looked. Dirt under the fingernails, sweat, physical labor. He wanted something different. And when he turned 24, he changed his last name, officially, to fit in better, to move up. He never talked about it. Never. When I was 13, I went to a construction site with my grandfather for the first time. Summer, heat, the smell of cement. He gave me a small trowel. "Hold it right," he said, "otherwise you'll get tired." I worked with him all summer. Mixed mortar, carried bricks, learned, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something real. At the end of the summer, he said, "People will forget your name, but if you build it right, your work will remain." Those words stayed with me forever. When my father saw a photo of me at the construction site, he said, "Delete that." I didn't understand why back then. Now I do. By the time I was 18, everything became clear. Michael was the pride of the family. I was the problem. I went to college, dropped out after a year. I didn't see the point. My parents were furious. "You're going to ruin your life," my father said, perhaps, but I already knew what I wanted to do. I went to work. At first, simple tasks. An assistant, carrying, holding, handing tools. Then more. I learned on the job, read at night, worked during the day. 3 years later, I passed my contractor's license exam on the first try. At 24 years old, I opened my company, a small one. Nobody in the family knew. They thought I was still working in construction. And I didn't correct them, because I wanted to prove something. First, to myself, then to them. By 2024, I had 19 employees. By 2025, 31. Revenue, $7.8 million. And still to my family, I was the one who works with her hands. And here's the moment that changed everything. The city put up a tender, restoration of a historic building. Value $11 million. I submitted a bid. Nobody believed in me. But 3 weeks later, I won. When I was signing the contract, the city representative said, "You know, your grandfather built part of this building." I froze. The circle had closed, and now we returned to Christmas. to that evening, when everything was supposed to change. After my grandfather's words, chaos broke out in the room. My father sharply said, "Enough." But my grandfather continued, "You are ashamed of what made you strong." He turned to everyone. He could build houses with his own hands. The guests exchanged glances. My mother turned pale. Michael remained silent. I just stood there, and for the first time, I felt no shame, only calmness. This was only the beginning. 9 days later was the gala evening. Contractor awards, 250 people, investors, architects, officials, and my family. They were all invited, not by me, by the organizers. When my name was announced, the room stood up. Applause. I stepped onto the stage, in a dress. But underneath, the exact same boots, I looked into the crowd, found my father's eyes. He was pale. And I said, "My name is Hannah Crane, and I build." Pause. "But my real last name is Kowalski," whispers, "and I am proud of it." I told them everything. About my grandfather, about the work, about the company, about the contract. When I finished, the room gave a standing ovation. I looked at my family. They weren't clapping. They were just sitting there, because for the first time, they saw the truth. After the event, my father walked up to me. He was silent for a long time. Then he said I was wrong. I looked at him and calmly replied, "Yes." We didn't hug. There was no dramatic reconciliation. But for the first time, there were no lies between us. A month later, I got a new contract. Even bigger, even more complex. And you know what the most interesting part is? Now, when people ask my father what his daughter does, he answers, "She builds." And there is no shame in his voice anymore. Only pride. And me? I still work in the same boots, because they are what brought me to where I am today. And because they proved one simple thing, sometimes the dirtiest hands build the cleanest results. 3 weeks had passed since the awards ceremony. Life had changed. Not abruptly, not like a fairy tale, but noticeably. I started getting calls, not from contractors like me, but from investors. Architects I couldn't even get a meeting with before were now offering collaborations themselves. One of them said, "We were following your project, but after that speech, it became clear who we were dealing with." I didn't understand what he meant right away. Then it hit me. It wasn't about the money, not about the contract. It was the fact that I didn't hide. But the real changes didn't happen at work. They happened at home. The first time, my father called me himself. That was strange in itself. "Do you have time for dinner?" he asked, without an order, without an ulterior motive. Just a question. I arrived. The same house, the same white carpet. But this time, Mom wasn't looking at my boots. She was looking at me, as if trying to understand who I was. It was quiet at the table. My father started to speak several times and stopped. Finally, he exhaled. "How many projects do you have right now?" I gave him the number, a pause. "And how many people work for you?" 31, I replied. He nodded, slowly. "That's more than I had in my department when I started." It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't criticism either. It was an acknowledgement. Michael spoke up later, when the two of us were left alone in the kitchen. "I checked," he said. "Checked what?" "Your company." I smirked. "Of course you checked." He shrugged. "Habit." A pause. "Did you really build all of this yourself?" I looked at him. "Yes." He nodded, and for the first time in his life he said, "That's impressive." Coming from him, it sounded louder than any applause. But the most unexpected thing was my grandfather. A couple of days later he called me. "Will you swing by?" he asked. I went to his house, a small, old house, nothing like the place where I grew up. He was sitting at the table with a folder in front of him, old, worn. He slid it toward me. "Open it." Inside were blueprints, old projects, contracts, photographs, and at the very end, a document. I read the name, Thomas Kowalski Construction. My hand froze. "This is my first legal entity," he said. "I closed the company when your father left." I looked up at him. "Why are you showing this to me now?" He looked straight at me. "Because you started what I couldn't finish." I flipped through the documents. "Grandpa, I want you to take it." I froze. "Take what?" "All of it." "These are just papers," I said. He shook his head. "No." A pause. "It's the name." I didn't understand right away. Then I did. He was offering to let me bring the company back. Not legally. The meaning. The history. "You want me to change the name?" I asked softly. He smiled. "I want you to do what you think is right." A pause. "But if you ever decide to bring it back," he tapped his finger on the document, "it's already yours." I didn't answer immediately. because this was bigger than business. It was a decision about who I wanted to be. That night, I stayed awake for a long time, looking at my company's logo, Crane Development Group, the name I had carried my whole life, the name that helped me get my first contracts, the name that wasn't real. A week later, I made my decision. At the next team meeting, I stood in front of my people, 31 people. Some had been with me from the beginning. Some had joined recently. I said, I have news. A pause. We are changing the company name. The room went silent. As of today, we are Kowalski Development. One of the foremen asked, why? I replied, because we don't just build buildings. A pause. We build history. The reaction wasn't what I expected. Not applause, not excitement. Just a simple, makes sense. And when do we start changing the signs? Sometimes the most important decisions are received calmly, because they are obvious. When my father found out, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, are you sure? He nodded. This will make your life harder. Maybe, a pause, but it will make my conscience easier. He didn't argue. A month later, the new logo appeared at the construction site, black letters on a white background, Kowalski Development. Grandpa came to take a look. He stood silently for a few minutes. Then he said, now, everything is in its place. And you know what changed the most? Not the business. Not the money. Not the status, the attitude of the people on the site. One of the workers once said to me, now it makes sense why you're here. I asked, in what sense? He shrugged, you don't play the part. What part? The boss. A pause. You're one of us. And that was more important than any award. And my father, he still wears suits, still works in finance. Nothing changed in that regard. But recently at a family dinner, his colleague asked, what does your daughter do? And he replied, she owns a construction company. A pause, and he added, the best one I've ever seen. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't need to, because some things don't require eye contact. They simply, finally become the truth. And me, I still work at the site, in the same boots. Only now they carry a name that was always mine.